Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had spent 7 years building one of the loudest political brands in America. But Mike Johnson needed only one basic question to expose how embarrassingly little that brand had produced inside the institution that actually paid her. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, you have introduced 42 bills in 7 years. How many became law? You do not need to be exact. An estimate is fine. Then came 9 seconds of silence, 9 long seconds under national television lights, with roughly 8 million people watching a congresswoman famous for instant reactions suddenly unable to answer with one simple number. This was not a complicated question about parliamentary procedure, committee jurisdiction, budget reconciliation, or a disputed interpretation buried inside hundreds of pages of federal law. The answer was zero. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez knew that saying it aloud would destroy the image of legislative effectiveness she had spent years selling to the public. Not zero controversies, not zero television appearances, not zero fundraising emails, not zero carefully staged confrontations, and certainly not zero social media posts designed to dominate the political cycle before most viewers understood what the hearing was even about. The zero applied to the one category that should matter most when evaluating someone who receives a congressional salary: to write, negotiate, and pass federal legislation. After 7 years in Congress, approximately $1, $2 million in taxpayer-funded salary, 42 sponsored bills, endless speeches about transforming the country, and millions of followers applauding every dramatic performance. Not one of those bills had crossed the final line and become law. Ocasio-Cortez had accumulated nearly every modern symbol of political success, except the result her job title was supposed to represent. She had fame, reach, influence, magazine covers, celebrity invitations, viral moments, and a national audience. But when the public record was stripped of branding and reduced to legislative output, the scoreboard remained empty. Mike Johnson did not need to shout, because shouting would have given Ocasio-Cortez the kind of confrontation she understands how to manipulate. He did not wave dramatic documents, manufacture personal accusations, or drag the hearing into an emotional argument about ideology, wealth, privilege, or partisan loyalty. He opened a plain 3-ring binder containing congressional records, legislative tracking data, and the kind of dry documentation that politicians usually ignore because it cannot be dismissed as theatrical outrage. The binder looked ordinary, almost boring, and that was precisely why it was dangerous. Ocasio-Cortez could fight an insult, redirect an accusation, or turn Republican anger into another fundraising opportunity, but she could not bully a numerical record into changing its answer. Before Johnson opened that binder, Ocasio-Cortez had been performing exactly as expected, treating the hearing less like a workplace evaluation and more like another production designed for social media circulation. She leaned toward the microphone, controlled her voice, paused at calculated moments, condemned Medicaid cuts, discussed housing, invoked working families, and inserted personal references designed to make the speech feel morally unquestionable. She mentioned the Bronx, attacked the Republican budget, and delivered polished language that could be separated from the hearing, uploaded online, and distributed before the committee had even moved to the next subject. Her communication system was already operating, because this was the machine she had mastered better than almost anyone in Congress. A hearing became content. Content became coverage. Coverage became political influence. And political influence created more opportunities to generate content. The system was powerful, profitable, and nearly perfect, except for the fact that it had produced attention far more consistently than it had produced legislation. Ocasio-Cortez had discovered that modern politics rewards visibility faster than achievement, outrage faster than negotiation, and performance faster than the slow, frustrating work required to move a bill through committee, secure votes, survive both chambers, and reach the president's desk. Her followers saw the speeches, the confrontations, the fashionable protests, and the moments carefully engineered to present her as the moral center of every debate. What they rarely saw was the empty legislative column behind the image. Johnson understood that the strongest way to attack her was not to deny her communication talent, but to acknowledge it and then force the country to compare that talent with the actual work product. He thanked Ocasio-Cortez for an effective opening and called her one of the most effective communicators in the body, possibly the most effective of her generation. The compliment was not surrender, admiration, or an attempt to soften what came next. It removed her easiest defense by making clear that Johnson was not questioning whether she could speak, attract attention, or control a camera. He was separating communication from legislation, the same way a teacher separates class participation from completed assignments. Ocasio-Cortez could not claim he was dismissing her talent because he had just recognized it publicly, and she could not hide behind the brilliance of the presentation once he announced that the discussion was moving toward results. Johnson had spent 17 years as a teacher, and he approached the exchange like a man returning a graded paper to a gifted student who had mastered every part of school except completing the work. The pace was controlled, the language restrained, and the accusation devastating, because it was built around ordinary standards that teachers, nurses, mechanics, small business owners, and taxpayers understood immediately. In every normal profession, charisma does not erase missed assignments. Public visibility does not replace output, and a polished explanation does not convert an unfinished job into a completed one. Yet Ocasio-Cortez had operated inside a political culture where media attention was repeatedly treated as evidence of accomplishment. Johnson was about to test whether that illusion could survive direct contact with the congressional record. Outside the hearing room, Ocasio-Cortez's staff had prepared for the familiar Republican attacks involving the Green New Deal, the Met Gala, protests, travel, and every controversy she had already learned to convert into political fuel. They had responses ready for accusations, ideological attacks, hostile framing, and emotional confrontation, because those battles allowed Ocasio-Cortez to widen the argument and escape the original question. What they had not prepared for was praise, followed by documentation, because praise removed the emotional defense, while documentation blocked the rhetorical exit. Johnson opened the binder, turned to the first tab, and began reading the numbers in the slow cadence of a teacher who had already checked the answer twice. But the first number was only the surface, because the comparison waiting on the next page would turn an unimpressive record into something far more politically humiliating. Johnson read the record without theatrics, because the numbers were already brutal enough. 42 bills sponsored, 3 receiving a committee vote, 0 passing the House, and 0 becoming law. He lifted his eyes from the binder and repeated the final number with the calm precision of someone stating a grade that had already been verified, not an accusation that could be argued away. Then he turned the page and placed Ocasio-Cortez beside the people working under the same congressional rules, where the average House member during the same period had managed to move approximately 2.7 bills into law, and the average member of New York's delegation had reached roughly 3.1. Ocasio-Cortez ranked in the bottom 10% of the chamber for legislative effectiveness, below about 90% of her colleagues across both parties, which meant the failure could not honestly be blamed on Congress being difficult, slow, partisan, or structurally resistant to legislation. Every member faced those obstacles, yet most still produced more than the woman constantly presented as one of the most important lawmakers in America. Johnson then introduced Linda Park, a small business owner from Flushing, Queens, whose life represented the kind of unglamorous responsibility Ocasio-Cortez regularly invoked in speeches but rarely had to confront as a measurable standard. Linda immigrated from South Korea in 1998, spent 22 years building a nail salon, paid roughly $38,000 a year in taxes, and during the pandemic completed 23 federal forms in 3 weeks to secure a PPP loan and keep her business alive. 23 forms in 3 weeks from a woman fighting to protect her livelihood stood beside 0 enacted laws in 7 years from a congresswoman receiving $174,000 annually to perform legislative work. Linda kept her doors open because ordinary people do not receive applause for intentions, followers for excuses, or magazine profiles for announcing how deeply they care. They either complete the paperwork, meet the standard, and survive, or they lose everything. Johnson did not need to insult Ocasio-Cortez because placing her record beside Linda's effort exposed the political absurdity more effectively than any angry speech could have done. Ocasio-Cortez immediately reached for the safest defense available, arguing that legislation was not the only measure of congressional effectiveness, and pointing toward constituent services, oversight, advocacy, and public awareness. Johnson did not deny that those responsibilities mattered, because dismissing them would have allowed her to escape into a broader argument about what members of Congress do beyond writing laws. He simply agreed that legislation was not the only measure, then reminded her that it was still a measure, and in the category that defines the word legislator, her result remained 0. Not low, not disappointing, not below average, but 0 after 7 years. A figure so absolute that every attempt to surround it with other activities only made the absence more obvious. The more Ocasio-Cortez listed the work around legislation, the more she sounded like someone explaining attendance, enthusiasm, and extracurricular participation while refusing to acknowledge that the final assignment had never been submitted. Johnson moved to the next section with a tone that almost sounded appreciative, noting that Ocasio-Cortez had certainly been busy, though the activity repeatedly produced publicity rather than statute. He began with the 2021 Met Gala, where the Tax the Rich dress generated national coverage at an event associated with a reported ticket value of roughly $35,000. Yet, the number of tax reform bills she sponsored that became law remained 0. He moved to her 2022 arrest during an abortion rights protest near the Supreme Court, another nationally circulated moment connected to demands for codifying Roe versus Wade, while the number of her sponsored bills accomplishing that goal also remained 0. Then came the Green New Deal, the signature project most closely attached to her political identity. But it was a resolution rather than an enforceable bill, never reached a final vote, and was never followed by successful statutory legislation converting the slogan into federal law. The Green New Deal became a brand, a fundraising mechanism, a rallying cry, and a permanent piece of progressive political language. But Johnson's binder was now exposing what happened when a movement built for attention was forced to answer the colder question of legislative completion. He continued to the 2025 Fight Oligarchy Tour with 23 cities, enormous online engagement, major campaign-style events, and more social media material than many members of Congress generate during an entire term. The legislative output connected to that national tour was again 0, creating a pattern too consistent to dismiss as bad luck, isolated obstruction, or one unsuccessful policy effort. Met Gala photographs, protest arrests, national tours, Instagram clips, TikTok videos, and sweeping resolutions all fed the same political machine, turning the congressional office into a content studio and the legislative chamber into a stage. Johnson called these the activities of an influencer, not because influencing public debate has no value, but because influencers do not receive a congressional salary for the specific institutional duty of legislating. And just as Ocasio-Cortez prepared to fight that label, Johnson reached the next tab, where her record on bipartisanship, committee attendance, and the issues she claimed were most urgent would make the 0 look less like obstruction and more like a deliberate operating model. The next tab stripped away Ocasio-Cortez's favorite excuse by showing that her weakness was not limited to final passage, because her bipartisan cooperation rate ranked 6th lowest among House Democrats. That mattered because legislation rarely moves through Congress without coalition building, negotiation, compromise, committee work, and the kind of unglamorous relationship management that produces no viral clip. Ocasio-Cortez had built a public identity around demanding sweeping action, Yet the record showed she co-sponsored fewer bipartisan bills than 94% of the members in her own party. Her committee attendance also fell below the Democratic average, despite assignments on financial services and oversight, committees directly connected to housing, banking, consumer protection, and the economic issues she described as emergencies. The louder she insisted those problems required immediate federal action, the harder it became to explain why her participation in the rooms where that action was developed remained less consistent than the average Democrats. Johnson removed his glasses, cleaned them, and returned to the experience that made his criticism especially difficult for Ocasio-Cortez to dismiss as ordinary partisan hostility. He had taught high school for 17 years and had watched talented students command classrooms, win arguments, impress teachers, and still neglect the repetitive assignments required to complete the course. Those students were often intelligent, charismatic, and convinced that visible brilliance should excuse the boring work they considered beneath them. They loved speeches, debates, recognition, and the feeling of being the sharpest person in the room, but they avoided worksheets, preparation, deadlines, and daily discipline. Johnson's comparison was merciless because Ocasio-Cortez's congressional record looked exactly like that pattern translated into national politics, where the performance was exceptional and the completed assignment was missing. He acknowledged again that Ocasio-Cortez was one of the most talented communicators in Congress, then drew the distinction she had spent 7 years trying to blur. Communication without legislation was still a speech, and a speech without a law entered the room, generated noise, collected applause, and disappeared without changing the statute book. The point was not that speeches had no political value, but that speeches could not be presented as substitutes for the institutional result a legislator was elected and paid to deliver. Ocasio-Cortez's defenders could celebrate her influence on political language, fundraising, media coverage, and progressive activism. Yet none of those achievements altered the legislative column under examination. Johnson was forcing the audience to judge her by the same standard applied to every worker whose employer eventually asks what tangible product was delivered in exchange for the paycheck. Then he returned to Linda Park, because the hearing was never truly about celebrity invitations, fashionable protests, or whether Ocasio-Cortez understood social media better than older members of Congress. Linda paid approximately $38,000 in annual taxes, and part of that money helped fund the $174,000 salary Ocasio-Cortez collected each year, totaling roughly $1.2 million over 7 years. Linda had completed 23 federal forms in 3 weeks because her business, employees, and financial survival depended on producing the required result under pressure. Ocasio-Cortez had spent 7 years surrounded by staff, institutional resources, national influence, and millions of supporters, yet the number of her sponsored bills signed into law remained 0. Linda's question was devastating precisely because it was ordinary. What measurable legislative result had taxpayers purchased with more than $1 million in salary? Ocasio-Cortez responded with the instinct that had powered her rise, widening the frame and attacking Republicans over health care, school lunches, tax policy, and treatment of working families. The move was fast, emotional, and familiar, designed to bury the original question beneath a larger partisan confrontation where moral accusation mattered more than numerical output. Johnson refused to follow her into that safer battlefield and brought the discussion back to her record, not his, not the Republican caucus, and not the entire history of congressional obstruction. When she blamed the majority for blocking progressive legislation, he repeated the same question about 42 introduced bills and how many had become law. She still would not say 0, because speaking the number herself would have converted Johnson's critique into an admission broadcast before millions of viewers. Instead, Ocasio-Cortez listed constituent services, public advocacy, oversight activity, co-sponsored bills, amendments, letters, caucuses, and every congressional function surrounding the results she could not provide. Johnson listened without interruption, allowing each defensive category to reveal that none of them filled the empty space at the center of the record. He then returned to the standard of ordinary employment, explaining that a teacher who failed to submit lesson plans for 7 years would not receive praise for passion, visibility, or good intentions. That teacher would be fired because taxpayers do not fund public employees merely to care, speak, appear busy, and communicate effectively while the central duty remains unfinished. But the most dangerous moment was still ahead, because Johnson was about to reduce Ocasio-Cortez's entire political machine to one brutal distinction between a show and a job, and that distinction would not remain inside the hearing room for long. Johnson drew the line with a simplicity that made every previous defense look weaker. Ocasio-Cortez's Instagram was a show, her TikTok was a show, and her Met Gala appearance was a show. He even acknowledged that they were effective shows, watched by millions and repeated across every major political platform. The problem was not that the performances lacked polish, energy, or influence, because Ocasio-Cortez had clearly mastered all three. The problem was that a show was not a law, and New York's 14th District had not sent her to Washington merely to produce content. Voters had sent her to perform a job, and after 7 years, the legislative result attached to that job remained zero. The room grew quiet because the distinction required no ideological loyalty to understand. Teachers, managers, nurses, mechanics, small business owners, and ordinary employees all knew the difference between being visible at work and actually completing the work. Ocasio-Cortez had become one of the most famous members of Congress by winning attention faster than nearly anyone around her. Yet fame had created a protective illusion, allowing popularity, outrage, and online engagement to be treated as evidence of legislative productivity. Johnson removed that illusion by replacing exposure with output, and once the standard changed, the distance between prominence and performance became impossible to hide. Ocasio-Cortez spoke again, but the rally cadence that usually powered her public confrontations had weakened. She listed co-sponsored measures, committee work, amendments, public letters, advocacy campaigns, and caucus participation, hoping the surrounding activity could compensate for the missing central result. Each item belonged somewhere inside congressional work, but together they sounded like participation trophies arranged around an empty final grade column. Johnson did not interrupt, mock, celebrate, or offer her another emotional fight that could be clipped into a comeback. He allowed the defense to continue long enough for viewers to recognize that she was naming everything except a law she had introduced and passed. Then, Johnson closed the binder, placed it flat on the table, removed his glasses, and set them on top without a victory speech. That quiet finality was more damaging than applause, because it suggested the evaluation was complete, and the record no longer required debate. Outside the room, Ocasio-Cortez's staff immediately understood that the problem could not be solved through the usual political response. The number was not a hostile quotation, manipulated video, personal insult, or partisan rumor that could be reframed by an aggressive communications team. It came from public legislative records, and every attempted explanation still ended at the same unchanged figure. Within 72 hours, the most damaging clips had spread to tens of millions of viewers. The first centered on the 9-second silence after Johnson asked how many of the 42 bills had become law, followed by Ocasio-Cortez refusing to provide the number. The second centered on the difference between a show and a law, a comparison that escaped partisan media because workers everywhere recognized it immediately. Teachers shared it, business owners shared it, managers shared it, and employees privately sent it to colleagues who had watched someone master the appearance of productivity while avoiding measurable results. The argument became larger than Ocasio-Cortez because it described an entire culture that rewards performance before performance produces anything tangible. Public interest then moved toward the legislative record itself, where the numbers confirmed the case Johnson had presented. Ocasio-Cortez remained near the bottom of the chamber in legislative effectiveness, introduced relatively few bills compared with other members of New York's delegation, and maintained one of the weakest bipartisan cooperation rates among House Democrats. None of that information had been concealed, classified, or locked behind inaccessible government systems. It had been ignored because political audiences were trained to evaluate public officials through slogans, follower counts, outrage cycles, and media visibility. Johnson's binder became dangerous because it forced attention away from the spectacle and back toward the ledger. Ocasio-Cortez's office responded by emphasizing constituent services, oversight, advocacy, and the importance of using a national platform to shape political debate. Those responsibilities were real, but the statement still amounted to an argument that legislative output should not be the primary measurement of a legislator. In any ordinary workplace, an employee defending an empty results column by questioning whether results were the correct standard would be understood as admitting the weakness. In Congress, the same admission was packaged as a rebuttal and delivered to reporters who understood why the statement avoided the number. The office answered every criticism surrounding the grade while refusing to confront the grade itself. The hearing also pushed the phrase "the show" into the political vocabulary as a description of lawmakers whose national visibility greatly exceeded their legislative output. The criticism was not limited to one party, because political celebrity had become a bipartisan business model built around constant attention, fundraising, and performative confrontation. Ocasio-Cortez remained the clearest example because the gap between her enormous audience and enacted record was unusually difficult to explain. Millions of followers stood on one side, while zero sponsored laws stood on the other. No amount of context could fully erase that contrast, because influence could not be counted retroactively as legislation. Her fundraising operation did not disappear, and controversy likely continued generating donations from supporters eager to defend her. Yet national fundraising could not answer the local question Johnson had placed before taxpayers in her district. They had paid more than $1.2 million in congressional salary over 7 years and received speeches, protests, tours, media appearances, and a political brand recognized around the world. What they had not received was a single sponsored bill signed into law. That was not a Republican slogan, a conservative interpretation, or an exaggerated campaign accusation. It was the measurable result recorded beside her name. Ocasio-Cortez was not exposed as untalented, unintelligent, or incapable of controlling the political conversation. Johnson openly recognized that she was exceptionally talented at communication, public pressure, and turning confrontation into influence. The hearing exposed something more politically dangerous. The abilities that made her famous had never produced the legislative result her office implied. Popularity could not transform 0 into 1, and $1 million salary could not make unfinished work complete. After the cameras, speeches, protests, tours, and carefully manufactured moments were stripped away, the final grade remained exactly where Johnson had placed it: 0.